Trade liberalization, embodied in the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, relies solely on the good faith commitment of the international community to reduce those subsidies. The affirmative's position, which they identified as support for the UNESCO Convention on Cultural Diversity, goes in the opposite direction. It creates ever-expanding groups of economic sectors that will not be considered in trade negotiations. It is this kind of bad faith that has kept the dollar stalled for over a decade. The reduction of trade barriers is a reciprocal process. The US has subsidies for agriculture, China has subsidies for solar panels, and so on and so on. The problem is that approaches like the affirmative and the UNESCO Convention signal a troubling lack of commitment to trade liberalization, as they establish an all-or-nothing approach to the gradual de-escalation of national support for industries. Pierre Suave of Harvard and Carsten Steinfeld of the Organization of American States explain that creating ambiguous exceptions for cultural expression risk being used as a guise for protectionism. They write that states should codify an explicit hierarchy of least burdensome means of supporting domestic cultural industries. Because of its fluid nature, a concept like cultural diversity could very easily become a favorite veil used to disguise protective measures, requiring the international trading system to indulge protectionist policies. While Suave and Steinfeld supported the principle of cultural diversity, they made clear that explicit codification of reciprocal and effective support for culture is necessary to stop the quick slide into protectionism. Unfortunately, neither the convention nor the position of the affirmative achieves this difficult but important balancing act. The UNESCO Convention's exclusion of entire industries is a massive blow against its promise of progressive trade liberalization. For example, the shared commitment of World Trade Organization member states to put all their protectionist policies on the table and in hopes of their eventual elimination. The trade regime relies on mutual trust that every other nation is committed to the elimination of trade barriers. Otherwise, the difficult and tedious process of negotiation is not worth it. The affirmatives, as well as many governments' support for culture, has not been delicate, but rather sweeping, ill-conceived, and heavy-handed. National governments have many domestic lobbying interests that incentivize and demand these sweeping support mechanisms. If we let each country's domestic lobbyists decide what kind of economic measure would best, there would be an endless rush to subsidize any and all commercial ventures. In fact, this economic system has been tried. It's called mercantilism. The problem with the affirmative's position is that there is no way to differentiate between good or bad cultural support policies. Crawford Smith explains, the convention covering the whole gamut of often controversial support measures, the convention makes no reference to principles such as proportionality or effectiveness, which could guide the application of these measures and serve to prevent more balanced forms of protectionism. What's more, the ambiguity and the very idea of cultural support makes it infinitely malleable and open to abuse. The affirmative's argument is persuasive at first glance, but upon deeper inspection, the principles of cultural expression and protection embodied in the UNESCO Convention are so vague that they have been easily manipulated to support protectionism and do nothing to support minority cultures and the developing world that are actually at risk. The affirmative also made the absurd notion that French culture might somehow cease to exist in a free market. That is an obvious red herring. Developed countries such as France and Canada promoted the treaty to support their political motivations and trade negotiations. They appealed to minority cultural rights coming from France, who had banned the wearing of hijab, and other European nations seems at best hypocritical and at worst deceptively self-serving. The French government gets to pick the cultures that are supported. This won't be the truly diverse cultures of minority peoples in France, but rather the culture of white francophone elitists. The convention does nothing to support indigenous cultures. The affirmative's offhand suggestion that their position protects native culture is indicative of a token gesture made by the Eurocentric nations that wrote and pushed for the cultural exception. Crawford Smith writes that for developing countries or minority groups, the convention offers nothing by way of concrete entitlement. Given that cultural diversity may be threatened as much, if not more, by forces operating internally within the states, the underlying preoccupation of the convention with interstate relations and international trade represents a clear limitation. The convention focuses then on affirming states' rights and defines these rights in extremely open-ended terms, giving real ground for concern that this, as the U.S. suggests, could turn into a protectionist charter. In fact, the convention has no way to mediate disputes between different cultures, within states or between them. This means that majority culture can justify government policies that are discriminatory against foreign cultures and people without any means of recourse by those who are excluded. It does not seem beyond imagination that xenophobic and racist trade policies could be justified on the basis of support for national culture. In fact, ignoring the important role of property rights in advanced indigenous cultures is itself a Western construct. Culture is property in many non-Western cultures. Only we view property as necessarily individually owned. The idea of communal property is a paradigm that demonstrates the possibilities of viewing culture commercially, valuing it for its contribution to the society as a whole. Rosemary Crom, professor of law, communication, and culture at York University, argues that we misunderstand the very concept of property if we focus primarily on a Western model of exclusive individual or corporate ownership, as so many critics do. Critics of cultural property wrongly conflate it with the narrow and fundamentalist paradigm of property that emphasizes alienation, exclusivity, and commodification. It would seem prudent, however, to avoid fetishizing a particular concept of property simply in order to counter certain fetishizations of culture. Thus,